The person who leaves a relationship because their partner was emotionally unavailable swears they'll never repeat that pattern, then 6 months later finds themselves dating someone who seems completely different but turns out to have the exact same withdrawal patterns. The person who escapes a controlling relationship carefully screens the next partner for any signs of that behavior, yet somehow ends up 3 years later feeling just as controlled but through completely different tactics. This isn't bad luck or coincidence. It's repetition compulsion, the unconscious tendency to recreate unresolved dynamics from the past, particularly from early attachment relationships, not despite the pain they caused, but because of it. The psyche doesn't repeat what was resolved. It repeats what remains unfinished, attempting to master old wounds by recreating their conditions as if getting the same scenario to end differently will finally heal what broke the first time. But without conscious awareness of the pattern and what drives it, the repetition continues, often for decades, with different faces and settings but the same underlying dynamics playing out with predictable regularity. The pattern shows up across contexts with recognizable consistency. At work, someone repeatedly ends up with bosses who undervalue their contributions, moving from job to job seeking recognition but consistently finding environments where their work goes unnoticed or unappreciated. In friendships, someone attracts people who take more than they give, the relationships feeling one-sided. Yet when balanced, reciprocal friendships are available, they feel boring or uncomfortable. Romantic relationships follow the most obvious patterns. The person who dates a series of partners who cheat, or a series who are brilliant but unstable, or a series who initially seem engaged but gradually become distant. The details differ, but the emotional experience remains identical. Someone might consciously seek different personality types, different backgrounds, different careers, yet the core dynamic, feeling unseen, feeling smothered, feeling abandoned, feeling like you're too much, repeats with each new. The internal experience involves specific contradictions. There's frustration at the pattern's persistence, the sense that you're doing everything right, being more careful about who you choose, setting boundaries earlier, communicating needs more clearly, yet somehow ending up in the same emotional place. There's shame at recognizing you're the common variable across all these failed relationships. The uncomfortable realization that you're not just unlucky, but somehow participating in creating what you claim to avoid. There's confusion about how someone who seemed so different at the beginning turned out to be functionally identical to the last person. The mind searches for explanations. Maybe all people are terrible. Maybe your type is fundamentally flawed. Maybe you're cursed. Anything to avoid the more disturbing possibility that you're unconsciously selecting for and eliciting the very dynamics you consciously want to escape. And there's loneliness in recognizing the pattern but not knowing how to break it. Watching others seem to find healthy relationships while you keep cycling through variations of the same dysfunctional dynamic. Repetition compulsion, the term Freud used to describe this phenomenon, operates outside conscious awareness as an attempt to resolve what was never resolved in the past. The adaptive function is clear. If a child's early attachment relationships were characterized by inconsistency, emotional unavailability, criticism, or enmeshment, the child's nervous system learned to organize itself around those patterns. The unpredictable parent created hypervigilance and anxiety. The emotionally distant parent created strategies for seeking attention or coping with neglect. The critical parent shaped a harsh internal voice and sensitivity to judgment. The enmeshed parent prevented the development of separate selfhood. These patterns weren't chosen. They were survival responses to the environment the child had no choice but to adapt to. As adults, those early patterns become templates, what attachment theory calls internal working models that shape expectations about relationships, predictions about how others will behave, and unconscious strategies for navigating intimacy. Someone with anxious attachment learned that love is inconsistent and requires constant effort to maintain, developing strategies of protest, pursuit, and hypervigilance to abandonment cues. Someone with avoidant attachment learned that emotional needs lead to overwhelm or rejection, developing strategies of independence, self-sufficiency, and discomfort with vulnerability. Someone with disorganized attachment experienced caregivers who were both source of comfort and source of threat, creating simultaneous desire for and terror of closeness. These patterns don't disappear with age or good intentions. They operate automatically, shaping who feels attractive, what behaviors feel like love, and what dynamics feel familiar enough to tolerate. The repetition serves multiple unconscious purposes. It maintains consistency with early templates. Familiar patterns feel safer than unknown territory, even when the familiar is painful. It attempts mastery. If the psyche can recreate the conditions that caused original wounding and get them to end differently this time, perhaps the old wound will finally heal. It confirms existing beliefs. If you learned that people leave, attracting people who leave confirms your worldview and avoids the discomfort of having to update your understanding of relationships. And it protects against vulnerability. If you keep choosing unavailable people, you never have to risk being fully seen by someone capable of genuine intimacy. The repetition feels like it's happening to you, like these people keep showing up in your life through bad luck. But you're actively, unconsciously selecting them based on subtle cues that signal they'll recreate familiar dynamics. The risk of remaining unconscious to this pattern is spending decades in relationships that recreate childhood wounds without ever healing them. Someone might have 10 relationships that all end the same way, each time believing this person was the problem, never recognizing their role in the selection process and the dynamic's perpetuation. Or they might avoid relationships entirely after enough repetitions, concluding that relationships don't work for them rather than understanding what specifically doesn't work and why. The pattern can also escalate over time as unresolved material accumulates. Each failed repetition adds another layer of hurt, resentment, and confirmation that you're fundamentally unlovable or that others are fundamentally unreliable. The hope that motivated the original repetition, maybe this time it will be different, gradually dies, replaced with cynicism or resignation. The social dynamics of repetition compulsion show how internal patterns shape external interactions in specific ways. Someone with anxious attachment unconsciously selects partners who are emotionally inconsistent or avoidant because those partners create the familiar tension between desire for closeness and fear of abandonment. Once in the relationship, the anxious person's behaviors, seeking constant reassurance, protesting distance, becoming activated by perceived threats to connection, often push the partner further away, confirming the original fear and reinforcing the pattern. The anxious person experiences this as the partner being unavailable. The partner experiences it as being smothered or controlled. Neither recognizes they're playing complementary roles in a dance choreographed by their respective attachment wounds. Someone with avoidant attachment unconsciously selects partners who are overly accommodating or willing to accept breadcrumbs of intimacy, because those partners won't demand the vulnerability the avoidant person fears. Once in relationship, the avoidant person's behaviors, maintaining independence, downplaying emotional significance, creating distance when things get too close, often create the exact dynamic they claim to want to avoid. They say they want partnership, but their actions ensure they remain isolated. A partner who initially seemed low maintenance eventually either leaves out of frustration or begins demanding more, at which point the avoidant person feels justified in ending things because the partner became too needy. The pattern repeats with the next person who initially seems self-sufficient. Micro-scenarios illustrate the mechanism. Someone meets a potential partner who is charismatic, intense, and slightly inconsistent, texts enthusiastically, then disappears for days. Most people would experience this as a red flag and disengage. But for someone with anxious attachment shaped by an inconsistent parent, this pattern feels like home. The uncertainty creates the familiar anxiety that gets misinterpreted as chemistry or passion. The person pursues the relationship, unconsciously recreating the conditions where love felt conditional and required constant effort. 6 months in, they're exhausted from the pursuing distancing dynamic, wondering why they chose another person who can't show up consistently. Someone else meets a partner who is extremely attentive, wants to spend all their time together, and expresses emotional needs openly. For someone with avoidant attachment shaped by an enmeshed or overwhelming parent, this feels suffocating. They start pulling away, finding reasons why the relationship isn't right, eventually ending it because they needed more space. They don't recognize they were never going to feel comfortable with someone available because availability itself triggers old fears of being consumed. Another scenario involves someone who repeatedly finds themselves in relationships with partners who are critical. They enter therapy declaring they need to stop attracting critical people. The therapist helps them recognize that they're drawn to people who replay their critical parents' dynamics because criticism feels like attention and engagement. Growing up, criticism was how the parent interacted with them. It meant the parent was paying attention, was invested enough to care about their performance. Indifference would have felt worse. As adults, partners who are warm and accepting feel boring or create anxiety. Are they not invested? Do they not care enough to push me to be better? The person unconsciously selects for criticism, then feels hurt by it, not recognizing they're recreating the only form of engaged attention their nervous system learned to recognize as love. Working with this pattern requires first recognizing it exists and operates outside conscious awareness, which means stopping the habit of blaming external circumstances or others' pathology and getting honest about your role in selecting and perpetuating dynamics. When a relationship ends or reaches a crisis point, instead of immediately focusing on what the other person did wrong, examine what feels familiar about this dynamic. Have you felt this way before? Does this remind you of past relationships? Does it echo anything from childhood? The pattern becomes visible through comparison across multiple relationships and between adult relationships and early family dynamics. Journaling helps track this by writing about each significant relationship. What attracted you initially? What the positive phase felt like? What the problems were? How it ended? What you felt during and after? Look for threads that connect them. The surface details differ, but emotional experiences often match precisely. Once the pattern is visible, the next work involves understanding what early template is driving the selection, blaming external circumstances or others' pathology, and getting honest about your role in selecting and perpetuating dynamics. When a relationship ends or reaches a crisis point, instead of immediately focusing on what the other person did wrong, examine what feels familiar about this dynamic. Have you felt this way before? Does this remind you of past relationships? Does it echo anything from childhood? The pattern becomes visible through comparison across multiple relationships and between adult relationships and early family dynamics. Journaling helps track this by writing about each significant relationship. What attracted you initially? What the positive phase felt like? What the problems were? How it ended? What you felt during and after? Look for threads that connect them. The surface details differ, but emotional experiences often match precisely. Once the pattern is visible, the next work involves understanding what early template is driving the selection. Attachment theory provides a framework. If you consistently choose unavailable partners, you likely have anxious attachment and are recreating a dynamic where love required pursuit, or where caregivers were inconsistently responsive. If you consistently choose overly available partners, then feel smothered and leave, you likely have avoidant attachment and are recreating a dynamic where closeness felt threatening to autonomy. If your relationships are chaotic, swinging between intense connection and complete disconnection, you likely have disorganized attachment, from early experiences where caregivers were both source of safety and threat. Understanding the origin doesn't immediately stop the pattern, but it provides context and reduces shame. You're not fundamentally broken or cursed. You're repeating what your nervous system learned was normal. The next layer involves noticing what feels like chemistry or compatibility might actually be recognition of familiar dysfunction. The person who makes your heart race might be activating your attachment wounds, not offering genuine compatibility. The relationship that feels easy and boring might actually be healthy but unfamiliar. This requires developing tolerance for unfamiliar relationship dynamics that don't trigger old patterns. For someone with anxious attachment, this means deliberately dating people who are consistent and available, even though that initially feels flat or anxiety-provoking in its security. For someone with avoidant attachment, this means deliberately staying in relationship when the impulse to flee arises, learning that intimacy doesn't have to mean loss of self. This feels unnatural because you're working against established templates. The work isn't trusting your gut. Your gut is calibrated to familiar dysfunction. It's learning to question your gut's judgments about who feels right. Another practice involves active reality testing during relationships. When you feel certain emotions, abandoned, smothered, invisible, criticized, pause before reacting and ask whether the current situation actually warrants the intensity of your response, or whether you're responding to old material. Your partner forgot to text back for 3 hours. Does that actually mean they're pulling away, or are you interpreting it through anxious attachment? Your partner wants to have a vulnerable conversation. Does that actually mean they're trying to control or consume you, or are you interpreting it through avoidant attachment? This isn't dismissing your feelings, but checking whether they match current reality or old templates. Sometimes the pattern is your partner actually is replicating old dynamics and the relationship isn't healthy. Sometimes the pattern is you're misinterpreting neutral behavior through old wounds. Both need addressing, but require different responses. Boundary work addresses patterns where you've been taught that love means self-sacrifice or that having needs is a burden on others. If your pattern involves relationships where you give more than you receive, practice asking for reciprocity, even when it feels uncomfortable or selfish. Notice whether your partner is capable of meeting needs when asked, or whether they consistently fail to show up. If they consistently fail, that's information about their capacity and your selection criteria. If they're capable but you never ask, that's information about your patterns. The work includes tolerating others' potential disappointment or upset when you set limits, recognizing that healthy relationships involve both people having boundaries and needs, not one person endlessly accommodating the other. The fourth practice involves deliberately building relationships with people who don't match your typical pattern, while simultaneously working on your own attachment security. This might mean therapy to process early attachment trauma, somatic work to help your nervous system feel safe with intimacy, or simply practice with friendships and relationships where the dynamics are different. Security isn't fixed permanently in childhood. It can be earned through corrective experiences. Relationships where people are consistently available, where vulnerability doesn't lead to abandonment or consumption, where conflict can be navigated without the relationship ending. These experiences gradually update the internal working models, showing the nervous system that patterns from childhood aren't universal laws of relationships. Integration means recognizing that changing this pattern isn't about willing yourself to choose different people or trying harder in relationships. It's about understanding and gradually updating unconscious templates that drive selection and shape behavior. You'll know the work is progressing when someone who would have once triggered immediate attraction now feels recognizably unhealthy, when relationship dynamics that once felt normal now feel uncomfortable, and when unfamiliar but healthy patterns start feeling more natural even though they initially created anxiety. The goal isn't perfect relationships or never feeling triggered. It's developing awareness of when you're responding to old material versus current reality, and building capacity to choose different responses even when old patterns feel more familiar and compelling. The repetition stops when you stop needing it, when the wounds driving it have been processed enough that recreating them no longer serves any function, when your nervous system has learned through experience that relationships can be different from what you learned in childhood. Childhood, when the templates update and new patterns become possible. The person who keeps attracting the same people has options once they understand this framework. They can stop seeing it as bad luck or others' failures and recognize their active role in selection and perpetuation. They can examine their attraction patterns with curiosity rather than judgment, asking what familiar wound each potential partner might recreate. They can learn to tolerate unfamiliar relationship dynamics that don't match childhood templates, recognizing that comfortable might mean dysfunctional and uncomfortable might mean growth. And they can work on earning secure attachment through corrective experiences and trauma processing, gradually updating the templates that have been running their relationship choices outside awareness. The repetition isn't curse or fate. It's unfinished business attempting resolution through recreation. The pattern breaks when the business gets finished, when old wounds are processed, when templates update, when the psyche no longer needs to recreate the past because it's finally been integrated and released.